How's everybody doing? Doing okay. So tonight we are talking about Nicholas Orontony. Nicholas is a pretty cool guy, and I think once we get down to the tail end, a few things should just be revealed about our history and who we are as a people. So our objectives for tonight, going to have to set a little bit of the historical background, kind of a teeny tiny little refresher, if you will. Then we'll talk about the influential war pole, the rebellion, and the name Wyandotte. Kind of a odd little mixture of some topics there. But we are starting our second quarter tonight. And everything that we've talked about the last 4 times that we've got together, outside of a few things where we go back and talk about, some things prior to the dispersal, but everything that we're talking about up until tonight has occurred within 50 years of the dispersal. And when you think about everything that we've discussed, it's hard to imagine that so much happened in such a very short amount of time. 50 years post-dispersal, up to 1701, where last week we saw the Great Peace of Montreal getting ratified and all the tribes basically coming together in a expression of peace. So Cadillac, after the Great Peace was signed in 1701, immediately and purposefully recruited the Huron tribe to come and live with him at his new fort. The Huron tribe, our grandmas and grandpas, were living at Michilimackinac, and they agreed, sorta, and began a slow, cautious migration to Fort Detroit. The migration was performed in 2 stages. The first number of citizens and the largest group actually moved in 1701 when Cadillac extended the invitation. And again, there was a smaller group that actually didn't move until 1703. They were very skeptical of what was happening. They didn't trust the French, and they were just wanting to sit back and see what would happen. And finally, in 1706, the last of the citizens, and there were just a handful at this time, left Michilimackinac for Fort Detroit. The Huron tribe, from the French's perspective, was absolutely critical for the fort's defense. The French used our warriors for defense of the fort, and they also used our warriors as their special forces. In 1701, another big event happened. In 1701, the Jesuits established the New Corn Feast among our people. And that feast was actually celebrated, and it was put into covenant with the tribe through that wampum belt right there. That is the New Corn Feast belt that we received from the French, from the Jesuits in 1701. And that belt is currently residing in our museum in Wyandotte, Oklahoma. And to think that we have that belt after so many years is absolutely amazing. So a little quote here from Cadillac. You've seen over the months that I like these little quotes. They kind of establish a lot of what was going on and give us a little insight as to what was happening back in that day. This is Cadillac, what he had to say about our ancestors. For they are malicious, intriguing, and evil-intentioned men, capable of great undertakings, but fortunately their sword is too short. Nevertheless, as they cannot play the part of lions, they act like foxes and spare no effort to embroil matters between us and our allies. So Cadillac was absolutely impressed with our grandparents, and at the same time, he was absolutely in fear of our grandparents. So he kind of compromised, and he allowed the Hurons to come and help him protect the fort and he knew the potential consequences of that act that he was doing. So in 1706, we saw last year, it's been a while, so quick little refresher. In 1706, we saw the Huron tribe and the Ottawa tribe got into a major disagreement. They had a significant falling out, and the grandmas and grandpas defended the Miami people when the Ottawa basically tried to attack and destroy them around Fort Detroit. At that time, we actually exerted some freedom from the Ottawa, because the Ottawa were the ones that actually brought us into the league of the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa. And the Ottawa thought that since they were the ones that came in and brought us into their league, that we should be vassals. We were there at their beck and call. And in 1706, we basically said, no, we're done. So they defended the Miami, and they also broke away from this bondage that the Ottawa tribe had over our grandparents. Again, in 1712, there was another little dispute. The Fox had laid siege to Fort Detroit, and they were allies of the British at the time. And this event in 1712 showed why the French actually wanted the Huron tribe to be there to defend the fort, because the diplomatic might that we brought to the French was put on full display, and nations came from all over the Midwest at our beck and call to help defend the French in the fort. And obviously, the Fox were absolutely defeated. Every single one of them, but one or two of their warriors were killed. That included men, women, and children. The women and children also was there at the siege. Again, in 1738, the Huron tribe and the Ottawa tribe got into another disagreement. This is when we stepped up after making peace with the Flathead and defended the Flathead against the Ottawa. It's again the Ottawa. They're kind of just always causing friction among the tribes. But we stood up and defended the Ottawa against the Flathead, which the Ottawa did not like that one bit. But at that point, we didn't care. Another little quote, and this is one of mine. In 1701, a feast that was even older than the New Corn Feast was likely adapted by the Huron tribe as allowed by the Jesuits. Allowed by the Jesuits? Yes. Any tribe that wished a relationship with the French had to allow for a little meddling into their personal business and establish traditions. This is partly why 46 years later, Nicholas rebelled and sought to distance himself and his people from the Jesuits' persistent meddling. Last month, we talked about the Jesuits and how they had inserted themselves into the business of all the tribes, and that business became to the point of almost breaking many of the tribes. So Nicholas, who we're talking about tonight, Nicholas Orontony was a war chief. He was possibly our war pole at the time that he became prevalent within the tribe. We know that he could be war pole because Nicholas Orontony was of the Porcupine clan. We do not know the year that he was born. The war pole, in case everybody's unfamiliar with that title, the war pole of the tribe, and I believe that this man actually carried a pole for war. He had kind of a staff, which signified him as the chief of all the war chiefs. So war pole was both a title and was also a representation of who he was by the staff that he carried. And during times of war, the war pole was second in command, only behind the head chief. Knowing that, Orontony was a very, very influential chief, because at this time that he came into prevalence, we were at war. The time of his birth, Orontony was baptized into the Catholic Church, like many other of our citizens. And at that time, the French and the Jesuits gave him the name Nicholas. Nicholas Orontony is best known in history simply as Nicholas. If you go out and you start looking for the man, you look for the name, that is the name that you will find. So that is the name that we're going to use from here out. Nicholas was first recorded as being in the tribe in a position of prevalence in 1730. By 1737, he had obtained a very prominent role within the tribe, and it's likely that he was serving as the war pole. And it's also likely in 1738, when we had our little disagreement with our second disagreement with the Ottawa, that Nicholas was the one who led our warriors in defense of the Flathead. A little bit of a side note here to kind of put the prevalence and predominance of who Nicholas was. Nicholas's grandson was Duamquat. He is also known as Pomoacan. That is the name that the Delaware tribe gave Duamquat. And Duamquat would also achieve a noted place in history of our people. And he is commonly found in history as the Half King. So the grandson of Nicholas is Duamquat, Pomoacan, Half King, whoever you want to call him. And he is the chief during the Revolutionary War period. He is the chief who was considered the chief of chiefs among all the tribe. So Nicholas's grandson held an extreme, probably one of the most powerful chiefs that existed, that lived during the time of the French and Indian War, as well as the Revolutionary War. Nicholas resided at Sandusky and was a wily fellow full of savage cunning, whose enmity, when once aroused, was greatly to be feared. So we find that Nicholas is living at a village called Sandusky. And we'll find out that that is actually the beginning of Sandusky. In 1739, Nicholas approached the French and asked if he could get permission to resettle. Nicholas wanted to move basically up around the St. Lawrence River, a little bit closer to where the Haudenosaunee lived. And the French quickly denied Nicholas's request because they kind of had a suspicion what he was up to. The kind of power, well, what kind of power did the Jesuits have over the tribes that controlled their freedoms? How is it possible that the Jesuits could tell Nicholas, could tell a nation that they cannot move, that they had to stay in one particular area? And we'll see that the Jesuits, we've talked a little bit about it last month, the Jesuits had quite a bit of coercive power that came with some dire consequences if any of the tribes questioned their power. And today, this is commonly known as a form of witchcraft. This form of manipulation that the Jesuits used basically causes people to do things against their own free will. And that is witchcraft, which the Jesuits enacted upon many of the tribes. They used their own traditions, they used their superstitions and their fears against them in a very, very controlling manner. The French, after Nicholas was denied, didn't have much of a choice in his actions. Nicholas basically defied the French, and he moved his band of Hurons south into the Ohio country. And this move brought Nicholas directly in contact with the Haudenosaunee and their English allies. At this time, there is good peace. It's been established because of the Great Peace of Montreal, but the Huron and the Haudenosaunee are now on very peaceful terms. At least a few certain bands of our grandmas and grandpas were in good relations with the Haudenosaunee. And the contact that was made with the English at this time is exactly what the French had hoped to avoid. They could not afford to lose their allies, the Hurons, because they are the ones that they are counting on to actually defend the fort, to fight their battles, and to hold off the French if and when it ever came to the point where war would be fought between the English and the French. And this contact with the Haudenosaunee is going back to the days of Baron, if you can remember our discussion about Baron. And the contact had been intermittent, but it had been never broken. There had always been this contact between certain factions within our tribe, as well as the Haudenosaunee. It's likely that when Nicholas moved into the Ohio country, that the Iroquois League, were the ones that inspired him to move in 1740 or thereabouts to the Sandusky River. The Iroquois still claimed the Ohio country. However, it was the Mingo that were the ones that frequently came into our villages. The Mingo were basically in control, being controlled by the Seneca. They were basically Seneca who had been adopted into their tribe, and they were now beginning to exert a little bit of freedom of their own, and they became known as the Mingo. We talked about that also last week. But the Iroquois gave Nicholas settling rights. They gave him permission to move into the Ohio country and claim it as their own. That was something that Nicholas just absolutely was enamored by. He actually had some land. He had this relationship established with the Haudenosaunee. And in 1743, he traveled all the way to Albany. And he publicly proposed an alliance with the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, and the English colonists. Nothing like this had been done before, except with the unfortunate situation that happened with the Baron. So now we have Nicholas basically making that contact and creating a relationship that the French were absolutely terrified of. Nicholas proposed that his people be admitted as the sixth nation of the Haudenosaunee. Just a few years earlier, the Tuscarora had been admitted into the League, and he wanted the very same thing for his people. And the Seneca denied his request. They indicated that the only way that we could come into the League would be through adoption. Through adoption, we would be thrown among all the different nations and absorbed into their tribes, and we would have to give up our independence, our name, and our freedom. And we'll see that Nicholas said absolutely no to that. The reason that the Seneca did not want Nicholas and his people to be brought into the League as an independent nation is because they were very concerned that this small group of people would eventually undermine their power and authority within the League. And the Seneca were not going to allow that happen. Unfortunately, the League did not admit our people in as the next nation, and we did not accept adoption. But unfortunately, that was big news at the time, and a lot of people were very concerned about that. And this is a very small section of a map that was done back, let's see here, forget the year, 1755. This is a map that was produced in 1755. And you can see here, this little swath that comes up here and reads down. It says this: these parts were by the Confederates allotted for the Wyandottes when they were lately admitted into their League. So this map, at the time that all this was happening, actually showed where we were living. It actually showed that we were admitted into the League of the Haudenosaunee, but it never came true. And to the best of my knowledge, this right here is a significant thing. Wyandottes. This is one of the first places that the name has actually been published and put out in print. There had not been before a situation where Wyandotte ever showed up in the historical records, except for a diary that we'll see here in a bit. So Nicholas refused adoption. The Wyandottes were not admitted into the League. Nicholas ended up settling at Sandusky, also known as Sandusky and Sandusky. And these were the islands off of the southern shore of Lake Erie, where the Sandusky River empties into the lake. Today, this is predominantly known as the area of Lower Sandusky. And in 1745, Nicholas even further solidified his relationship with the English and gave them permission to build a fort. This fort was the first blockhouse. It wasn't this massive fort. It was just a almost impenetrable blockhouse that the English built, and it was the first blockhouse built in the Ohio country. Fort Detroit is not considered part of the Ohio country. So the English built this fort just at the doorstep of Fort Detroit in the French's backyard, all at the invitation of Nicholas. So in 1747, Nicholas killed 5 French traders in his village. These Frenchmen were uninvited. When they walked in, Nicholas was very offended, and he didn't just kill them, he chopped them into pieces. He made them an example. He did not want the French in his village. He used these 5 traders as an example,
Yep.
and he took everything that they had brought into trade. So his message to the French was pretty clear: stay away. Fearing that a war with the French was inevitable, the other bands of the Huron that were still living in Fort Detroit quickly denounced Nicholas. He was denounced by Sarasetse. Sarasetse represented the Deer Phatre, and I can't pronounce his name very good, but the chief of the Wolf also joined the Deer and denounced Nicholas. However, again, I can't pronounce his name very well. The chief that basically led the Turtle Phatre, which the porcupines are part of the Turtle Phatre, he stood in support with Nicholas in this pending revolt that's about to happen. So a little bit later, we'll talk about this because this was a big deal. We can begin to see where there's a little bit of not so much of a cohesion between the 3 parent tribes of our nation. The Deer and the Wolf, those are basically the Wyandotte. And then we have the Turtle Phatre and the other Phatre, the other clans that were brought into there. They are the ones that are representing the Wyandotte. So Nicholas had basically broke away from the Deer and the Wolves that were still in Detroit and created his own little faction in the Ohio country. That's a big deal. So Nicholas had devised a plan to eradicate the French at Fort Detroit, and he was going to also eliminate the French from within the Miami country. Nicholas called his allies to war, and they came. And that is an expression of his power that he held at the time, because when he said come, they came from all over. The Miami and the Huron, our grandmas and grandpas, were going to exterminate the French from the Miami country. The Potawatomi were going to eliminate the French from the Bois Blanc Islands. The Fox were going to attack the settlement at Green Bay. And notice here, we're just a few years earlier, we were fighting the Fox. The Fox are now one of our best allies. And Nicholas had chosen Fort Detroit. He chose the prize of the fort as his own. The day of this uprising was set to occur during the holiday of Pentecost. And to give you an idea of what time frame we're looking at here, in 1747, the day of Pentecost fell on May 22nd. So about this time, May 22nd, is when this uprising was going to happen. And the Miami, the Huron, the Potawatomi, and the Fox were going to obliterate the French from Fort Detroit and the western region of New France. A little refresher on the Jesuits. And I'm not going to read this whole thing. I'm just going to go down to that very last sentence. We read this last month, I guess, when we were talking about the Jesuits. And this fitted well what the Jesuits had devised. This fitted well with the genius of the confessional to discover the piccolotes of the common man and wipe his slate clean. So the Jesuits were using the confessional to their advantage. And this played out perfect for them.
There is green beans and broccoli and cauliflower and a pork chop. I know you don't love pork chops, but
I think pork chops are pretty good.
oh heavens, I'm so sorry.
So Nicholas was overheard making his plans for this attack on the French by an Indian woman. We don't know what nation she was. We don't know her name, but we know that she had overheard him making plans of the attack. She was troubled by this. So she ran to the Jesuit priest, and she went into the confessional and she spilled the beans. She told this Jesuit priest everything that was going to happen. In return, the Jesuit priest went running to the governor of Fort Detroit and told the governor about Nicholas and what he was planning. So Nicholas's rebellion was spoiled before it even began. Because of him being found out by the French, he was forced into a truce before one shot was fired, or one arrow was shot, or one knife was thrust. And that caused him to have to move from Sandusky into the Miami country to seek protection from the French. The French at that point basically put a mark on his back, and they were going to take him out, even though they had reached an agreement that he would not do anything like this ever again. So about this same time, Nicholas had sent some emissaries. He had sent some of his diplomats to the east. They were making their way toward Logstown, which is in western Pennsylvania. Logstown is right today on the eastern border of Ohio, right on the line of the western side of Pennsylvania. And Logstown back in the day was the place in which all the different nations came together to discuss things with the English. The Pennsylvanians had set up this place. They came to talk, they came to trade, they came to barter, they came to socialize. It was the happening place at the time. And Nicholas sent some of his emissaries to Logstown. And this happened. On September 6th in 1748, Colonel Conrad Weiser wrote something down that for us forever changed our history. He wrote down in his personal journal a name that had probably never been written down before. And we'll see here in a little bit what that name was. It was a massive deal. So this is what he wrote. Colonel Weiser said that he had counsel with the Wyandottes. The Wyandottes. The other name there, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, is what the Haudenosaunee called Nicholas's little band of Huron. Nicholas, when he sent his people out there, did not identify himself as a Huron. He identified himself as a Wyandotte. Nicholas is still in the Miami country while his emissaries are out at Logstown. And he moved his band over to the White River, the Cogan River, which is near present-day Cleveland, Ohio. From there, he went further east. He continued over to the area of Beaver Creek, which is in western Pennsylvania, just a little bit north of Logstown. And for unknown reasons, but I would speculate that Nicholas got into a little difference of opinion. He got into a little fist fight, if you will, with the Seneca, and that forced him to actually have to leave the region of Beaver Creek. When he left, he traveled all the way down south to the forks of the Muskegon River, and he settled for a while at Conchicay. He didn't stay there too long. In 1750, we know that Nicholas had moved back up into the area of the Sandusky Plains, where he died. And when he died, his little rebellion came to an immediate cease. It died with him. The area in which he settled in the Sandusky Plains would eventually become known as Upper Sandusky. So that was a place that was very special to Nicholas. That was a place where he had chosen to stay and where he died. And that became, in 1750, the place in which this new people, known as Wyandottes, chose to stay. It is because of Nicholas and his defiance and the resistance to the Jesuits' constant meddling that his and our true identity was revealed. Nicholas was a porcupine. Nicholas belonged to the turtle phratry. Nicholas was Wyandotte. Nicholas was not a Huron, and Nicholas was not a Wyandotte. He was Wyandotte. And from that Wyandotte, the English basically wrote down Wyandotte. The Pennsylvanians wrote down Wyandotte. It got changed to Wyandotte, as we saw on the map. And over the course of about 30 years, it finally settled into the spelling that we know today, Wyandotte. So it's because of Nicholas and his rebellion against the Jesuits that we can see what our true ancient and traditional name actually is, Wyandotte. If he had not defied the French, we would probably be still known today as the Huron. There's a bunch of sources for you to start reading through, and that's all. That's Nicholas Orontony. Any thoughts, questions, or ideas?
There's a question, where did the Wyandotte TTE spelling come from?
That is basically the French and their way of putting a little extra flair on a lot of things. Wyandotte with a TTE is French. It's Wyandotte, as the French would say. Wyandotte was actually used for the first time in the Treaty of, I think it's 1718, if I can recall correctly. It showed up in that treaty, then it kind of disappeared for the longest time. It wasn't used until the Treaty of 1867, when the English, Americans are expressing a lot of English ideas, but it was in 1867 that the name was basically brought back out and put into the Treaty of 1867. The US government did that purposefully to show a little bit of a differentiation between the absentee Wyandotte that were still in Kansas and didn't make it all the way to Indian Territory. So the name Wyandotte started off as French and was put into the prominence that it is now by the United States government. If you want my opinion, we should have stayed with Wyandotte. There is a lot of records from 1867 all the way up till the early 1870s where our direct grandmas and grandpas basically refused that name. They continue to identify themselves and they choose to write their name out as Wyandotte, not Wyandotte. So the Wyandotte initially started with the French. Any more questions? Okay.
I'm sorry, Melinda had asked earlier when you were talking about the Baron. She just asked if you could remind us who the Baron is.
Oh yeah, I see him see that up there now. The Baron, he was a contemporary of Conderonk. The Baron came into prominence in a very unsavory kind of a way because he was basically trying to bring a demise of the tribe. The Baron had formed a relationship with the Haudenosaunee. He was trying to bring the English into Michilimackinac, and he was doing that in a very destructive kind of a way because he wanted the Huron people, as we were known at the time, he wanted them to become Haudenosaunee. The Baron was not concerned about the tribe actually coming in and being adopted into the league as a standalone nation. He was content with all of our citizens being just distributed out among the different tribes of the Haudenosaunee. Whereas Nicholas, he wanted us to remain sovereign. So the Baron basically in history has been branded a traitor in the way that he tried to bring a demise to the tribe. And he stood up and tried to undo everything that Conderonk was doing in a positive way to protect the tribe. Any more questions? So Nicholas is very important to us, not only because he didn't have a choice. Nicholas could not choose what his name was when the French basically brought him into the church. He was given the name Nicholas. I would imagine that he himself did not necessarily use that name. He continued to use his name, Orontony, but the English, the French, everybody else recognized him by his English name, Nicholas. It's not that he actually allowed himself to be renamed. It was something that just happened. And that's not anything that was uniquely special that the French did. We see a lot of the names today that a lot of our citizens are wearing. When we were still at Upper Sandusky, and the Mission Church, the Methodist Mission Church, was actually very prominent within the nation. And a lot of the names that we see today within the tribe were names that were given to our citizens by the Methodists. And they were actually well received. A lot of the surnames that we see today is of Methodist origin. So that was commonly done by the French, the English, and the Americans, because if you look at some of the names that our citizens have, and we've got some of our clan names that have been preserved, they were extremely difficult to pronounce. They were also very long, difficult to write. And the missionaries, the French, the English, the Americans, they had a hard time with our names. So they thought, yeah, we'll just give them a name that we can write. And that was the name that Orontony received, was Nicholas. He didn't have a choice in the naming of that. Not many of our people chose to join the church, but yet a lot of our people did choose to join the church. And if we could actually take the time and look at the internal politics that was going on, and I don't want to get too far into this because this is what we're going to talk about next month. There was a lot of internal strife within the tribe. There was this little unraveling of the cohesiveness that had brought the three dispersed peoples together, our grandmas and grandpas, and that was beginning to show a lot of stress. There was a lot of loyalty to the Catholic Church that we could see among some of the different clans, and there were absolute hate that was expressed toward the Catholic Church by other clans. And let's just wait until next month to kind of start breaking that down a little bit, because next month we're going to talk about Baby and Bobby, which are two chiefs. They aren't very well known. We don't know a whole lot about them, but we do know that they took opposing sides. So we'll talk about that next month. So to answer that direct question there, no, Nicholas did not choose to go into the Catholic Church. He hated the Catholic Church. Okay. So next month, Baby and Bobby. That's okay. We're getting ahead of ourselves because everybody, I think, is beginning to see how all of this is intertwined, how it's all playing out. Hopefully everybody can see how complex all of this was at the time. And when we look back, if you go back to a lot of the history books that have been written about the tribe, they overly simplified everything that was happening. They put a bad impression of our history, of our people out there. And if they actually could understand how complex things were, which most of the historians back in the late 1700s, early 1800s didn't take the time to break all this down. So if you start reading, there's a bad light about everything that happened with the tribe. And it's complex. So hopefully everybody can see as we start breaking this down a little bit more clear as to why some of the decisions that were made within the tribe actually occurred. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I think we're done, Kim.
I will stop recording.
Yeah, this way we don't talk too much about next month.